This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey horror fans, I'm the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary based on a serial killer. And this is one that I don't own. It's one that I've seen. It's on Netflix, so we're not going to get a DVD of it as much as I'd love to own it. Because we all know how Netflix is with their original content. But it's one I have seen. It came out in 2021. And it's based on probably my favorite case of a serial killer from Britain. And that is Memories of a Murderer, the Nilsen tapes. Of course, based on Dennis Nilsen. It was directed by Michael Hart. And it was put out by, I think it's called Raw Productions. The same company that did Don't F with Cats and The Most Hated Man on the Internet. Both of those are pretty good documentaries as well. Now, it's kind of a one-and-done documentary. It's not like a 3, 4, 5-part series. But judging by the title and just the overall format and the backdrop of the documentary, it's probably going to draw parallels to like the Conversations with the Killer series, like the Bundy tapes, Gacy and Dahmer tapes. It is done very, very similar. Now, I don't know if that's by a design, because the Conversations with the Killer series is so popular, or if it's just because the whole documentary is kind of built around these 250 hours worth of recorded audio tapes that Nilsen made in his cell. He was a very prolific audio diary keeper. I mean, it's only like 85 minutes. It's pretty short. And it does have sort of like the up close showing the of inner mechanisms of like a tape recorder as the documentary is going on. That's sort of the aesthetic and the backdrop of it. And it pretty much very similar to like the Jeffrey Dahmer files, which was my last review. Actually, Nilsen has been considered and long since called the British Jeffrey Dahmer. It really just kind of goes over his arrest, trial, and the aftermath, though it does go into some of the victims as well. You get interviews only from people that were involved with the case, the lead investigator, some of the other law enforcement that was involved. You actually get an interview by Russ Coffey, who wrote Conversations with the Killer, this book, which these two books I have not read yet. I got these two for Christmas. This is Nilsen's actual autobiography, which came out, I think, the same year. Because on the cover it says featured in the Netflix documentary, the Nilsen tapes. But yeah, he died in 2018, so this came out after that. I think this came out during his lifetime. But you also get interviews with like a survivor, the son and mother of another one of his victims. It really focuses on the social climate of London at that time. So it's very similar to like a Dahmer documentary because it does tell how and why Nilsen was probably able to get away with so much, because a lot of his victims were not only homeless, runaways, male prostitutes, but it was a very homophobic climate back then as well. So it does dive into that. You do get a lot of info from the survivors and the family members of that climate. Like one survivor who is homosexual saying how he couldn't testify against Nilsen. He didn't want to come out against him because then he would be vilified and chastised by the community for being gay. So it's not just about Nilsen and his crimes, or how he got caught in the investigation and the trial. But you do get a lot of stuff from the victims' families, the survivors, and just the social climate of London at that time. And of course, the voiceover, there's a ton of voiceover, which again, the format of the documentary, why you could probably draw parallels to stuff like this, is because all the voiceover of Dennis Nilsen is actually him. It's actually from the recorded audio tapes from his cell. And there's a weird aura to it. The tapes aren't like a textbook confessional. He's not just saying, well, my childhood was this, I came from here, this is what I went through. It, it's almost like a monologue, like it's very poetic. Uh, it's almost like he's. Uh, it's kind of more of like musings more than anything. So it does create this really dark portrait around the entire thing. I really like the interiors of where these interviews are taking place. Like the lead investigator, McCusker. It very well could be in Nielsen's actual attic flat in the Cranley Gardens. I'm guessing it's a studio, but this empty, derelict attic apartment, that's where he's sitting during these interviews. It, it creates this very 1980s rundown London look. So that really helps just the atmosphere of the documentary very, very well. And yeah, it's a lot about his crimes. You get a lot of insight from him. There were things that I learned, about Nielsen from this. For example, stuff about his grandfather. Everything I had heard and read about his grandfather up to this point has pretty much changed after watching this. He says stuff about his grandfather that I never heard anywhere else. So it is very, very good. It does seem to have more of like a kind of a social commentary bit to it, more than your typical serial killer documentary. Uh, there are stories about how Nielsen probably could have been caught sooner, but the police covered it up because he was once a police officer. So it's very, very interesting. Again, I love the look of it. They do go to a lot of locations, such as there's this one fort that's actually photographed in this book. Oh, you also get a ton of video archive footage. Interview with his mother, Betty White. Yeah, her name's actually Betty White. Video archive interviews of like the mothers of some of his victims. A lot of news footage, a lot of investigation footage, especially the excavation at his previous apartment on Melrose Avenue. So, kind of like the Dahmer Files, yeah, which I believe it's this fort. There's actually some stuff filmed there as well. One thing that was interesting that kind of creates this, kind of shows Nielsen in a bit of an enigmatic light, similar to the Dahmer Files with Dahmer, was we never get any interviews with Nielsen talking to the camera. We do get a ton of video footage of like him being led from like the police van to the courthouse or to the police van from the station. We do get a couple home movies of like when he's talking to the camera, but it's like a home movie footage. But we never get like video recorded interviews with Nielsen. The only voice we get about his crimes are through these like darkly poetic audio tapes. So yeah, I do have these two books, but there is a book companion to this documentary called The Nilsen Tapes. I ordered that forever ago. It was supposed to be here like last week, but it hasn't come in yet. So yes, I do have that coming, along with Killing for Company, which is actually the basis for the David Tennant film, which I will get to. So yeah, this is like 3 hours long, but I will get to this film. And the book that's based on will be here as well. I have already reviewed Cold Light of Day, which is kind of like a Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, loosely based film on Nielsen. So yeah, there's a ton of stuff on Nielsen out there. Unfortunately, I got a lot of it late. Like I got these two for Christmas. I got 2 more coming. But yeah, if you were a fan of the Conversation series, Bundy tapes, Dahmer Gacy tapes, then you're really gonna like this. It's a lot shorter. Again, it's only 85 minutes. It's one part, but it does have that same aesthetic, like with the tape recorder and hearing the buttons click and seeing like the inner mechanisms of how it works. All the voiceover is from him himself. We do get a lot of scene like shots of like all the all the audio tapes that he actually did record. I mean, there's stacks of them. It does go into uh, the interview with Coffee, Russ Coffee, does go into how Nielsen been wanting to write this autobiography forever and how he covered it and it became that book. So yeah, there's a lot of material in here. It does briefly go into his childhood, his time in the military, time with the police, stuff about his grandfather when he first realized he was gay. I think it goes into the time he almost drowned and was saved. Doesn't really go into much about his personal life, like his relationship with a young man named David or his dog Bleep. We do hear on one audio recording him talking to his bird Tweedles, which is mentioned in his autobiography. We do get an audio recording of him playing his keyboard. So there's still a lot of stuff in here, even though it's not your typical born in life, died in kind of textbook life story documentary. It is done very similar to the Jeffrey Dahmer files, where it picks up in 1983 with his arrest, law enforcement talking about how and why they showed up at his apartment building in the Cranley Gardens, and we actually see through video footage like the manhole cover being lifted up, pictures of the remains that were found, like the human flesh chunks that were left. So this is definitely darker and probably a bit more graphic than some other serial killer documentaries on Netflix, which, being on Dennis Nilsen, I would kind of expect it to. But still a very, very good documentary. I really enjoyed it. It has this very dark, intimate atmosphere to it. First-hand accounts from surviving victims and the family of victims, which really creates a different light than a lot of these documentaries that almost feel like I don't necessarily feel like documentaries glorify serial killers. I think some people just take it that way. This one tries not to. I think by having interviews with the victims' families and the survivors, it really keeps in focus who Dennis Nilsen was and what he did. Now, of course, it doesn't quite shed light on how he was this desperate, lonely guy that more or less killed out of desperation and then just grew to love it and became this really depraved serial killer. Though it also talks about, his makeup and what he would do with the mirror. Anyone that's read about Nielsen knows about that. So it's still very informative, even though it really focuses on sort of this one time frame and forward. But still very informative, very well made. It's edited and shot very well. I really like all the voiceover tapes from Nielsen himself, which is another thing that kind of reminds me of like the Conversation series. But yeah, very solid documentary. Definitely check it out if you haven't. Again, it's on Netflix. It's only 85 minutes. So yeah, check that out. I really enjoyed it. So with that, I guess we'll get into the summary and then just a vague list of topics that the film covers. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film is based on. So Dennis Nilsen, aka the Kindly Killer or the Muswell Hill Murderer, is one of, if not Britain's most notorious serial killer, killing 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983. Though he originally confessed to 15, he later admitted that he fabricated 3 of them, and to this day only 8 victims have ever been identified. Nilsen, an alcoholic, lonely man conflicted by his homosexuality, would lure his victims from pubs and gay bars, mostly gay men who were runaways, male prostitutes, or drug addicts, back to his apartment and give them alcohol or food and then strangle them or drown them in the tub. He would then bathe their bodies and keep them for weeks, talking to them, eating with them, laying with them, and even practicing necrophilia, though he always stated he only masturbated onto the corpses as they were, quote, too beautiful for conventional sex. Once decomposition would set in, he would dismember the bodies and either store them under the floorboards of his basement apartment on Melrose Avenue or flushed the organs and unwanted flesh down the toilet in his attic apartment in the Cranley Gardens in North London. Nilsen spent 11 years in the military before becoming a police officer, but left shortly after when he was unable to arrest a gay couple, which was a crime at that time in England. He then became a civil servant in 1973 or 74 in the unemployment department until his arrest in 1983. He was known for his incredibly ordinary appearance, never missing work, and due to his method of luring young men with food, shelter, or alcohol, he earned the name the Kindly Killer. After his trial in the fall of 1983, he was convicted of 6 of the 12 murders and sentenced to life. While in prison, he aimed to write an autobiography and would often record his thoughts and memories on tape. His autobiography, History of a Drowning Boy, was released in 2021, 3 years after his death on May 12, 2018, at the age of 72. Due to the nature of his crimes, his victims, their ages and backgrounds, his luring methods, how he killed them, the compulsion to want to keep a companion, the dismemberment of and saving of the bodies and or body parts in his apartments, and the neglect and attitude towards his victims and homosexuality from the police and public, along with details of his background, has led to him also being referred to as Britain's Jeffrey Dahmer. And so now we get into the film itself, and again, similar to like Conversations with the Killer, it opens up with some voiceover tapes, and then like it shows the tape going in to the tape recorder, and then the tape itself going through like the spools and everything, which is always really cool. I love seeing stuff like that. Opens up with the close-up mechanisms of a tape recorder, voice of Dennis Nilsen, and then inside of the prison as the voiceover continues. We get news footage of the initial outbreak of the story, shots of the house in the Cranley Gardens. Also, along with just seeing the tape recorder, we also get the typewriter, because I think Nilsen had 4 typewriters throughout his life in prison. So we'll get up close of like a line in the typewriter as he sort of types thoughts or whatever the topic is about. Like it'll say, I was a homosexual, ... I was ashamed, or something like that. So it will kind of preface whatever the next topic is going to be through the typewriter, which I thought was really cool. So it says, London, 1983. Detective Inspector is Stephen McCusker. He's one that's interviewed. He kind of reflects on initially being called to the apartment. We do get arrest footage and, a footage of the Cranley Garden apartment building, the manhole, pictures of some of the flesh that was found, photos of inside of his flat where he lived, which does look eerily similar to the inside of Dahmer's apartment. I mean, same color carpet, white walls, similar furniture, very limited like bookshelf space or anything on the walls. Instead of a fish tank, it's like a bird cage. It looks very similar to Dahmer's apartment. Also shows a picture of the closet or the wardrobe that was open to find the trash bags of the body parts in it when they first arrested him. It goes into the interrogation, both with an interview from McCusker and Nilsen's voiceover. We get an interview with Douglas Bentz of the Daily Mirror and how he first covered the case. Voiceover of Nilsen discussing his lunch that day. I'm guessing the day of his arrest. I watched this last night. And then there'll be some timestamps in the font of like a typewriter. It'll say like 48 hours after arrest. News footage of Nilsen after his arrest. People talking about how normal he was, how like they couldn't wait to see what this monster looked like, and then being shocked that he looked the way he did. How his mother was contacted. We get photos of her, archive video footage of her, voiceover from her. Then with her and Nilsen's voiceover goes into his childhood and talking about his grandfather, and they're both kind of conflicting. Nilsen talking about how he was an unwanted, uncared for child. His mother saying, I was always there for him. I always loved him. So it's very contradictory. Uh, Voiceover when he realized that he was gay. He says around 8 or 9, in the shame that he felt for it. McCusker talks more about the interrogation at uh, Hornsey Police Station, how they just let him talk. They didn't even ask him questions. And there are photos. I don't think it showed any. It was shirt unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up, just kind of leaning back. They just let him go and talk about whatever. Uh, and how they learned how most of his victims were gay, and how it was kind of a standout at that time, or they thought it was. Uh, then an interview with Bob Brenton, who was a detective sergeant, about how when he worked with Dennis as a police officer, sharing this one story when he should have arrested him, but he wasn't allowed to. It was covered up, even though it was after he was a police officer. Uh, then it says 2 weeks after arrest, discovering identities of other victims at in the excavation at uh, uh, Melrose Place, and we get actual video footage of the excavation. In an interview with Martin, it just says Martin, but that's Martin Hunter Craig, who was a guy that was lured back to Nilsen's apartment and survived. Nothing really bad happened, but he said Nilsen kind of acted a little odd and suspicious. And, he does go into how he felt he couldn't report Nilsen because, then people would know he was gay. He felt the police would ignore him. He had nowhere else to go. So just kind of talking about how he had nowhere else to go after that or what to do. Uh, home video of Dennis in one of his homes. I'm sure people have seen this video footage when he looks younger. He's got like the really curly hair in the front. At one point, I think his shirt is off. But yeah, it's the only time we actually see Nilsen talking to the camera. But again, it's home video footage. And then we get an interview with, it just says Shane, but it's Shane Levine, who was the son of the 11th victim, who was Graham Allen, who was killed in September of '82. Some places will say the 14th victim, uh, which no, Nilsen only killed 12, but at the time of his arrest, he was probably 14th because Nilsen did fabricate 3 victims. So overall, he was the 11th victim. And, which I always read it was September of '82, but we also get an interview with Graham's widow, Leslie, and she says it was October 31st, where he went missing. He was a drug addict, how he left the house, never came back. And actually, Shane Levine is one of the people that spoke out against this film, saying that it was garbage, the hair pieces were awful. He said David Tennant was good, but he said that the movie was garbage. So I guess we'll have to see. I'm sure it means something different to him, but and how they found out he was a victim. The phone call they got, and when police met with them to talk to them about Graham. And then Leslie goes into detail about how they told her exactly what Nilsen did to Graham and his body, and how she listened to all of it. It's kind of rough stuff. You don't always get stuff this detailed or graphic, and at least a lot of some of the Netflix ones you do, but a lot of TV program ones like this, maybe not so much. But so then we get an interview with Russ Coffey about how he read, which he's a journalist. He read that Nilsen wanted to write autobiography, so he corresponded with Nilsen about wanting to cover the story of him writing an autobiography, which of course turned into this book, which I am very excited to read. His mother and Dennis's voiceovers go into his grandfather and their relationship, and how his death impacted Dennis. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but there was something I did learn about his grandfather that I'd never heard before that kind of surprised me. And the fact it came from Dennis itself, it was something that was has still never been proven, but it comes from uh, Nilsen himself. Uh, his time, it goes into, oh, and then pictures of like him in his underwear sitting in front of his keyboard, uh, audio recording of him playing the keyboard. It then goes into his time in the army, making himself up to look like a corpse and masturbating in front of the mirror, pretending that he was a corpse. 8 months since arrest. Uh, the pattern of the 7 identified victims, how they prepared for the trial. Video footage of interview with Frances Sutherland, mother of William Sutherland, the fourth victim, who was killed around August 20th of 1980. Voiceover of a tape from Monday, October 24th, 83, on the way to number 1 court of Central Criminal Court in Old Bailey. Nilsen talking about how he's in a police van on his way to the first day of trial. And then it goes into the trial, how he was found guilty, get more video footage and stuff. And then all the interviewees, which there's more that I didn't mention. Like there's a female law enforcement member whose name I missed, but she talks about the discovery of bodies at the different locations. They all reflect on the first moments of the trial, archive news footage of the trial, and Nilsen's plea. We get an interview with Ivan Lawrence, who was his defender. They all discuss his sanity. It goes into Carl Stoddard, who was another survivor. Voiceover of Stoddard detailing his account with Nilsen. He was another survivor. I don't know if that's Stoddard himself or an actor. I could be. I didn't quite look into it. The neglect and carelessness from the police towards survivors with complaints. News footage of the verdict and Nilsen being driven away and just the crowds of people clapping. And then everyone interviewed just kind of sums up their thoughts on Nilsen. And then it just ends with text saying only 8 of Nilsen's victims were identified by police, and then it listed their names and ages at the very end. And that's Memories of a Murderer, the Nilsen tapes. Again, it's one of my favorite cases, probably my favorite case to come out of Britain. Definitely probably the most notorious case to come out of Britain. If everything is true, I'd probably say he's the second most prolific next to Harold Shipman. But I do find this case to be very fascinating. I'm very excited to get in all 4 books once they're all here, especially History of a Drowning Boy, his autobiography. But yeah, if you were a fan of the Conversations with the Killer series, this one is set up essentially the same way, with shots of the tape recorder, tons of voiceover, archive footage, interviews with people that were involved. Again, a lot shorter. But maybe set up a little bit more like the Dahmer Files, where, it's not, it does kind of create this mystery or kind of paints him almost like an enigmatic figure, because even the footage we get of him, it's short glimpses, like him walking, looking at the camera, then turning away. No video interviews of him, it's all voiceover. I probably would say it is closer to this. Like, I don't know if that's by design or just the notion that, it's all made from the 250 hours of tapes, and that made sense. But still, a very, very, very solid documentary. It doesn't cover his whole life in depth, but it is kind of equal between his crimes, his arrest and trial, and some insight from survivors and his families. So I really enjoyed it. It's on Netflix. Go check it out if you haven't already. I am waiting on some stuff to come in. I will be covering this soon. Again, it's like 3 hours, so I got to find the time to watch it. But I'm very excited to check that out. And there are more documentaries on Netflix that I will be checking out. I already went through the whole list of documentaries, so I already know what's on there, what they all are. I will get to the ones I want to watch, so yes, I know what's on there. But yeah, so stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.